Oh yeah.
John Lusk here of Lusk Archery Adventures, serious testing, successful hunting. Today I want to talk about broadhead flight. When it comes to bow hunting and broadhead selection, this is the most misunderstood concept that there is by far, far and away. The least understood concept is broadhead flight and what goes into it. The misunderstanding, it's really revealed by a few common comments or questions. One is the question, does that fixed blade fly like a field point? I get that question all the time. People want to know, does that fixed blade fly like a field point? Another comment is, well, no fixed blade heads fly well. You just need to get a mech because no fixed blade heads will fly well. Get a mechanical broadhead. A third comment is people will say, well, this fixed blade head flies really well, but those heads, they don't fly very well at all. And they're criticizing the broadhead. Any of those three comments all reveal a major misunderstanding when it comes to broadhead flight. And I don't mean to be condescending. I've said those same things, okay? I've asked those questions. I've said the same things over the years. But as I've learned, I realize like how uneducated most archers, most bow hunters are when it comes to broadhead flight. So I want to share this video just to help you understand it a bit more. I get so many of these questions, so many of these comments that I'm hoping this can kind of circumvent and help educate people more. Now, I'm not an expert in this, all right? I'm probably going to say some things that are wrong, and please feel free to correct me, make comments in the comment section. I really would appreciate it. We can work together like a community and help everybody in that way. But I do want to share some things that I think will help. Now, I run the risk in doing a video like this of oversharing. I remember when I was a kid asking my dad a question like, Dad, how does a car work? How does a car engine work? And he'd say, well, son, and he'd start describing the pistons and the air-gas mixture and the combustion and the spark and the pistons driving around. And I just was like lost after the third sentence. I was like, I didn't want to know all that. I would just tune out. And so in order to help you understand broadhead flight like this, I got to get kind of deep, all right? I'm going to make it as fun and as basic as I can, but please don't tune out because if you do, you're never going to understand it. And you're going to keep asking the wrong questions and you're going to keep making the wrong kind of statements, okay? So bear with me. I'll try to make it as simple as I can. But when it comes to broadhead flight, there's several different categories, dynamics that we need to talk about here. The first is arrow flight in general, arrow flight. When it comes to arrow flight, like you take an arrow, you put it in your bow, right? You knock it, you draw back, and there is so much energy that's stored right in those cams and in the limbs and so forth, and you depress that release. Boom! That string just drives against that nock. And I don't know if you've ever seen it in slow motion, but it's kind of cool. You can Google it there or look on YouTube, and you'll see that the arrow just flexes so much from the incredible pressure that's put on it. And it's just like wobbling like crazy as it shoots out of the bow. Now, as it leaves the bow, its flight is affected by several different things. First of all, it's affected by the bow's tune, by the tuning of the bow. Now, when we talk about bow tuning, there's a lot of different things we're talking about here. We're talking about the cam timing. Cam timing means like the cams rotate, they turn over at the precise same moment, okay? That's the timing of the cams. Or we're talking about the nocking point, making sure that your nocking point is at the precise location. Or we're talking about rest alignment and finding the center shot, that your rest is properly aligned to make sure that that arrow is leaving in the perfect center way. Or we're talking about cam lean. And you know, when you have like the cables here having to be pressed to the side by a roller guard so they don't get in the way, that creates a little bit of a cam lean that can mess up the timing and or the tune of the bow as well. So those are just some of the things that affect a bow's tune. Now, if you get it at a shop or you take your bow into a shop, the experts there and the technicians are really helpful and can help make sure that you get your bow tuned. Typically, they'll tune it through paper. And what that means is if you haven't done it, you'll shoot an arrow through a big line of like butcher's paper or something at a few feet away, and you can see what happens to the arrow's flight right away that sometimes the arrow will be flying like sideways kind of, and you'll see the tear in that paper will be like that long, and you're like, whoa, the arrow's flying to the side. Now as it goes down range, it'll make up for that because these vanes, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, they correct the problems and get it back on course. But you're seeing initially as the arrow leaves the bow that something's wrong if it's flying like that, okay? And so the technician there, or you can do it yourself, will adjust all those things, the timing, the cameling, the yoke tuning, the center shot, the knock point, I mean all these different things to make sure that your arrow is leaving straight. And that's when you'll see a bullet hole, just a perfectly round little hole with the vanes cut out through the paper. Okay, that's when the bow is properly paper tuned. Then you can do another thing that I like to do called bear shaft tuning. Good friend of mine, Shane Chunning, taught me how to do this, and it really makes a difference when it comes to broadhead flight. But bear shaft tuning is basically the principle is when you shoot an arrow with the vanes, as I mentioned earlier, the vanes correct a lot of the problems that are existing in the broadhead flight. They cause the arrow to spin and they steer it back on course. But you want to find out what's going on in the what's going on with the arrow flight before it's corrected by the vanes. What's really taking place? And so that's where shooting a bear shaft, a shaft with no vanes at all, reveals that problem. So what you'll do is, like, say you can start at 10 yards, or you can go to 20, 30 eventually, but you'll shoot an arrow, or a few of them, with vanes, and then you'll shoot one that's just bear shaft without vanes. And then you look at two things. One, you look at the point of impact. Are the two arrows, the one without vanes and the one with vanes, are they hitting at the same point? If not, your bow's not properly tuned. Okay? Or a second thing is maybe they're hitting at the right point of impact, the same point of impact, but they're at a different angle. That the one with vanes goes straight in, and then the one without vanes, the bear shaft, is like at an angle like that. And you're like, what the heck is going on? Okay, that's revealing a problem in the arrow flight. So you'll work with that, and you can Google that, you can search for that, how to do bear shaft tuning. And once you tune your bow that way to where your arrows with vanes and without vanes are having the same point of impact and they're penetrating that target at the same angle, they're parallel, and that's when you know your bow is really well tuned. So it's worth looking into this. So the whole first area when it comes to broadhead flight is your bow tuning. That's the most important. But then we also have to understand about the arrow itself. Okay, there's several dynamics and characteristics of an arrow that make a difference in how well it flies and how well a broadhead flies out of it. The first is the spine. The spine just is a measure of the stiffness of the shaft. And the thought is that as that string depresses on the arrow, it's flexing so much. Well, you want it to flex a certain amount. Otherwise, if it's super stiff and doesn't flex at all, that string could just push it off course. But if it flexes too much, it's just going to wobble way too much, and it's not going to fly well either. So you want to make sure that it's properly spined, has just the right stiffness. And that's a number you can see in the arrow shaft there. It'll be like 400 or 500 or 300 or 330, something like that. Sometimes people think that's the weight. Okay, that's not the weight. That's the stiffness. And it's measured by a certain amount of weight is like hung in the middle of a shaft of a certain length, and how much deflection there is at that center point is what's measured as like 0.300. That's a 300 spine. That means it's bending, it's flexing 0.300 inches. Or if it flexes more, 0.500 inches, it's flexing more. That means it has more flex. So the stiffer the arrow is, the smaller deflection, the smaller that number is. 100 versus 500. 100's really stiff. 500 super flexible because it's sagging there, or it's flexing 0.500 inches as opposed to 0.100 inches. Okay, so that's the stiffness. That's really important to use like an Easton chart, a stiffness spine chart, to determine what's the proper spine for your arrow. Very important when it comes to an arrow flying well. Now, another area is your front of center, or your FOC. That just means how much weight forward is the weight of the arrow. If you didn't have any weight in the front of the arrow, if it was just equally balanced and you try to throw it, it'd be like trying to throw a dart without a big heavy tip on the front. It's just going to fly off course. But you put in some weight there and enough weight, and then, man, it's going to like really fly well, right? Just like a dart. It's going to go in the right way. So front of center just measures the distance between the midpoint and what is the balance point of the arrow. Like if you look at this, the midpoint is about right here. The balance point is like right there. So that distance as a percentage of the overall distance, that's the front of center. It's the amount of inches of shaft percentage-wise that are ahead of the center point of the arrow. So, some people, most manufacturers recommend like 9 to 13 or something front of center. Personally, I like to go like 20 or even higher because I found that it helps my broadheads to fly a bit better with heavier FOC, with more weight up front. So that's FOC. That affects the flight of your arrow. So the next area to talk about is the arrow's straightness, okay? The straightness of the arrow, kind of the standard straightness of an arrow that you buy, just at the store, kind of a low end, is 0.003 inches. So that means it's pretty straight, but like 0.003 inches off, okay, of straightness at a certain length. Or you can pay a lot more and get like a 0.001 inch of straightness. I shoot these, okay, I know these are really expensive arrows, but at 35 inches, they're sub 0.001 inches off, okay? They're like extremely straight. That does affect the flight of an arrow, okay, the accuracy of an arrow. And then, as I mentioned earlier, is the fletching. Okay, so the fletching works, like I said, as kind of a tail rudder, and it provides the rifling, if you will, that if it spins the arrow and it keeps it on course, it makes a tremendous difference, making up for any kind of a wobble or errant flight to the arrow. You can also put on the vanes or the fletching either straight or offset or helical. Personally, I like to use an Arizona Easy Fletch with these boning blazers, but I know there's other ways to do it too. But that puts a helical, and a helical just means that each vane has a curve to it, that it's not just offset. Offset means it's kind of at an angle. Straight means it's straight. But helical means that it's actually curved, and it puts like a 3+ degree curve on each vane. What that does is it causes tremendous spin. Now, you're going to lose a little bit of speed because it's kind of slowing down the arrow a bit, especially at longer range because of that resistance, but it's going to help steer that arrow, especially with a fixed blade broadhead, a lot more accurately and effectively. Okay, so that's the arrow itself. So we talked about the bow tune, talked about the arrow itself, and then the third area is just your personal bow, okay? Your personal bow setup. There's factors that affect your forgiveness and your flight, like the brace height, okay? The distance from your string to your riser. Okay, the longer the brace height, the more forgiving that's going to be, because if it's like a short little height, the smallest little variation in your wrist, and man, it's going to make a big difference in how that arrow flies. You may not notice it with a field point, but you will notice it with a fixed blade head. So your brace height is an issue. Then your axle to axle. The longer you have between the axles, between the cam, the more forgiving it's going to be, because if you can move it just a little bit this way or that way, you're going to notice it if it's really long, but if it's really short, you may not notice it, but it'll make a difference in how that broadhead flies. Then the fourth big area is your personal form. And this is huge. And we all like to think that we have really great form and really great consistent form. But there's a reason that like professionals are professionals. And those guys that are like really good, it's not by accident. And maybe they're using the exact same gear that you or I are using, but they're just so much better. Personal form makes a difference. How you put your bow on your grip, how consistently you do that, how your release is, your follow through, any extra pressure or torque on your bow or any inconsistencies therein, they're going to really be revealed by a fixed blade broadhead. They may not be revealed as much by a field point, but they will by a fixed blade broadhead. So consistency of your personal form is another big issue. So those are the four big areas that affect arrow flight in general, okay? The bow tuning, the arrow itself, your personal bow's specifications, and then your personal form. So if you put all four of those together, when you have a properly tuned bow, and you have a properly built arrow, and you have a properly constructed bow, like for the specs that you want, and you have proper form, you put all that together, you're going to get optimal arrow flight. Now, when it comes to the point, okay, a field point, as you can see there, I mean, it's like a bullet. There's like no resistance. That thing is just lined up with the shaft, and it's just going to fly, boom, like a dart. But when you put on like a fixed blade broadhead, there's definitely a physical difference there. And for those people that say like the arrow is going to fly exactly the same with a fixed blade as a field point, that's just not physically possible. Okay, look at the difference. There is a difference, and that's going to have different physical characteristics affecting the flight of your arrow. But you can get it very close. But you got to understand there is a difference. So some of the things that matter the most are the overall surface area. If you look at a head like this, look at the difference in surface area between the field point and between the broadhead. Major difference in surface area. Or if you look at this one as opposed to this one, man, what a difference in surface area. So by and large, the smaller it is, the more like a field point you have a broadhead being, then the more forgiving it's going to be in flight. The more surface area, the less forgiving. So two blades typically are the most forgiving because they have the least surface area. Three blades, on the other hand, you look and you go, wow, you got three blades. Man, that's a lot more things that are going on there. A lot more. As that thing is spinning, that's causing all kinds of different, turbulence and issues that can steer the arrow off course. And you compare different three blades even, you see there's quite a difference between the different three blades. These both have similar cutting diameter, but man, they have a lot different surface area. Well, the one with the least surface area is typically going to be more forgiving than the one with the most. Or you compare it to a mechanical. And you look at like this original fixed blade that we looked at versus a mechanical, and you go, well, shoot, this one looks like a field point. Yep, and that's why it flies more like a field point. There's less surface area. So those are just some of the things that are facts about broadhead design, because what happens is with a fixed blade broadhead in the front of an arrow, it's kind of working like the vanes are in the back of an arrow. It serves like a rudder. And if the arrow is at all going off course, then it can do what's called planing. It can catch the wind, and it can just go even more off course. Whereas a field point is just not going to plane. It's just going to stay on course. So any imperfection is going to be especially revealed by the fixed blade broadhead. And the more that surface area, the more it's going to reveal your imperfection. Now, if your bow is really well tuned and your arrow is properly set up and your bow is properly set up and you've really worked on your form and your form is set up well, then pretty much any fixed blade broadhead is going to fly relatively well. It's not going to fly exactly like a field point. Okay, that's just kind of physically impossible. At lower ranges, it will. But if you go out to 100 yards, there'll be a little bit of a difference, no doubt. There's more turbulence that's created. There's going to be a little bit of a difference. But out of a very well-tuned bow with good form and properly set up arrows, you should be able to pop balloons at, say, 70, 80, 100 yards with pretty much any fixed blade broadhead there is. Now, what if you feel like your bow is well tuned, you feel like your form is really good and you have the proper arrow, but your broadheads aren't flying well? Well, then you've assumed wrongly, okay? And that's just a fact that if your bow is really well tuned, and if you have proper form, and if you have a properly set up arrow, most fixed blade broadheads are going to fly very well, and they'll group relatively well with your field points, again, out to all different ranges. But say you have one that's not, and say you go, man, I really like these broadheads, and it's just not flying like my field point. What do I do? Well, what you don't want to do, unless it's like the morning of your hunt, which it's too late to be preparing anyway, but what you don't want to do is just adjust the sight to where you shoot a field point and then you shoot a broadhead and you go, okay, I'm just going to change the sight to where my broadheads hit right where I want them to go. You can do that, but what's happening is your arrow is not flying right. And so, yeah, that broadhead may have the right point of impact because you changed your sight, but it's flying at a little bit of an angle, and that's going to affect penetration, or that's going to be affected by wind, and that's just not going to be the most deadly, lethal setup that you can possibly have. So you want to make sure that you take the time to make sure that everything is properly tuned. So if you have a broadhead that's not going well and you're like, man, what do I do? I thought my bow was well tuned, but this broadhead isn't doing well. Well, one, you want to make sure you spin the arrow, spin that broadhead, make sure that it's all spinning well, that there's not a slight bend in your insert or a bend in that broadhead. And again, don't just change your sight to make it, kind of force it into place. But then what you want to do is what's called broadhead tune. Now, personally, I don't ever do this because my bow is well tuned, and I've just not had a fixed blade broadhead that doesn't fly well for me because my bow is really well tuned. But if it were the case, and in earlier years, and honestly with other bows I've shot in the past, I did have that problem. So I shouldn't say I don't have a problem. I don't have the problem with the setup I have now, but in the past I have had that problem. So you can, with each individual broadhead, do what's called broadhead tuning. And what that means is you take an arrow with a field point and you shoot it at a target, start at like maybe 15 yards, somewhere close, okay? Maybe you don't even want to go back to 20 yards, like 10 yards you could start with. You shoot it at a target. Then you shoot one with a broadhead. Same arrow and everything, you shoot with a broadhead. What's the difference in the point of impact? Maybe you look and you go, gosh, the broadhead is shooting 3 inches to the left of the field point. It's amazing how much that broadhead can steer it off course. The problem is not necessarily the broadhead, okay? It's the tune. So what you want to do then is you want to slightly change your rest. Slightly change your rest to follow the field point. That's the best way to start. Follow the field point. You only want to move your rest about 1/18 of an inch. I mean, as small as you possibly can. If your broadhead is shooting 3 inches to the left, start by moving your rest just 1/18 of an inch to the right. Chase the field point. And then see what a difference that makes. If you go, I don't notice a difference, move it another 1/18 of an inch. And then you go, well, okay, yeah, they're getting closer. Now my field point and my broadhead, they're getting closer. Okay, move it a little bit more to where they're hitting at the exact same place. Now maybe now you're hitting 3 inches to the right of the bullseye. That doesn't matter as long as they're grouping together, the field point and the broadhead. Then you move your sight, you re-sight in the bow, and then both of them are hitting the exact same point. The arrow's flying well, it's going to penetrate well, and you're getting optimal flight with that broadhead. Or maybe you start adjusting it, you move your rest a little bit to the right, and then it's like way off course. You go, whoa, the problem's getting worse. Okay, well, some bows and some setups, you got to go the opposite way. So then just try moving it a little bit to the left. Again, small increments, 1/18 of an inch, 1/18 of an inch. And you can do the same thing vertically. So you just chase the field point until you get the broadhead and the field point hitting the exact same spot. Then you move the sight to where they're hitting in the center at the bullseye. Then move it back to 15 yards or 20 yards. And you keep doing that and keep making those adjustments until both of them are consistently hitting at the same point out to whatever distance you're going to be shooting those broadheads. Maybe it's 20 yards, maybe 30, maybe 40 yards. So that's broadhead tuning. You can do it for any individual broadhead. But again, what you don't want to do is just critique the broadhead saying, these things are crap, they don't fly good. You don't want to be asking the question, well, do they fly like a field point? Those questions and those comments only reveal that you're kind of missing the boat when it comes down to it. Even broadhead manufacturers, they play into that for marketing's sake, and they'll say, flies like a field point. Well, it does out of a very well-tuned bow, but that doesn't mean it will out of your bow. And maybe you read that, you buy it, and then you shoot it, and you're like, they lied, okay, they're lying. Well, they're not lying, they're assuming that your bow is really well-tuned. So take the time to make sure your bow's well-tuned. Take the time to make sure your arrow is properly set up, that you have the right stiffness, that you have a good straight arrow, that you have healthy FOC, that you're putting some helical twist or at least an offset pattern to your vanes to get some really good spin and forgiveness going on there. And then make sure that your bow has a healthy brace height, or maybe a healthy axle to axle for your shooting form, and then just work on your own personal grip alignment, grip adjustment, release, and consistency of form. You do all that, and then paper tune, and then bare shaft tune, and then if you have to, broadhead tune a specific broadhead to your field point, and then you'll be getting optimal broadhead flight. Now let me go back and comment a bit about mechanical heads. Some people, some purists would say, well, if your bow's well tuned and your arrow is properly spined and set up and you have really proper form and so forth, then you have no need to shoot mechanical broadheads because fixed blade broadheads can fly really well. Well, fixed blade broadheads can fly really well, but that doesn't mean that there's not a value or a purpose for mechanical broadheads. For me, my bow is really well tuned and I can shoot broadheads really well, but I still like to shoot mechanical broadheads. And the reason is these things are just extra forgiving. So when you add in nerves, okay, you're a little nervous. I mean, that's the incredible thing about bow hunting is, I mean, you're like so relaxed and rested. I mean, you're fighting to stay awake in a tree stand or something. Then all of a sudden, boom, there's this adrenaline jump and you're just like panting and your heart's just beating out of your chest. And all of a sudden you got to draw your bow back and shoot. Man, you're not going to be in your best form, right? Or things can happen just so fast, or there can be a lot of wind that day. All those factors can also affect broadhead flight, but they'll affect mechanical broadhead flight a lot less than they'll affect fixed blade broadheads. Because mechanical heads, because they just have such a low profile, they are going to be a lot more forgiving in flight, even if all your bow is well tuned and you typically have proper form at the range and your arrow's fine and everything else because of those extra factors. Another thing about mechanical heads that's an advantage is you can get a really wide cut and still have a very forgiving flight. If you used like a broadhead like this one by Alien, okay, it has 1.5 inches of cutting diameter. Okay, that's really significant. Now, again, out of a well-tuned bow, if you have seen my review of this broadhead, it shoots very well for me. However, if you add in nerves, you add in a lot of wind that day and so forth, then it's definitely not going to be as forgiving as a mechanical head. And yet, it has the same cutting diameter. So I can get a much more forgiving head with a bigger diameter cut. That's the advantage of a mechanical. So just having everything all well tuned and so forth and falling into place doesn't mean there's not a value for mechanical heads. There still can be because they're just so doggone forgiving, and they have such a big cutting diameter while being so forgiving. So you have to choose what's really best for you and your setup based on the animal that you're hunting, based on your personal bow, your personal form, your arrow, how well it's all falling into place, and what your maximum range is for shooting. If you're going after antelope, pronghorn, or something like that at 100, 120 yards, then man, you might want to consider, especially in windy, nervous conditions, consider a mechanical. Or, you know, based on your hunting setup, maybe in your personal form, maybe you go, gosh, at 40 yards, I need every bit of forgiveness I can get, even if my bow is super well tuned. Well, then you ought to consider a mechanical as well. So there's advantages both ways. But the point of all this is, it helps to understand what makes a broadhead fly effectively. Remember all of these factors: the tune of the bow, the setup of the arrow, the bow itself and its specifications and so forth, and then your own personal form. If you have all 4 of those in place, you've eliminated a lot of the factors right there. But then also, in terms of broadhead selection, the lower the profile, the more forgiving that broadhead is going to be. Please feel free to ask any questions you may have or make any comments or correct something that I said in error. I know I'm probably done a bunch of that here, but let's just have a good discussion here in the comment section. And please feel free to reach out to me on Facebook or Instagram or any of the forums that I post these videos on, anything like that. I'm eager to help in any way, shape, or form that I possibly can. Good luck to you and happy hunting.